Remember the story of the Jericho walls in the book of Joshua? Well, now there's actual proof that it actually existed just as it was stated, not only in the Bible and the story of Joshua, but also from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is evidenced by an archaeological site. Archaeology is a great tool. It's not just used to prove the Bible, it's used to prove history. It is physical evidence of history that has happened.
These 2,200-year-old texts that were discovered here in cave number 4 were hand-copied from even earlier manuscripts, and they are our best source for what happened at Jericho in the ancient past.
Yeah, right out of this very section came sections of the book of Joshua, the sections we have from Qumran.
And so how important do you think it is to use the biblical text and the archaeology that's been done at Jericho to interpret what's been found there?
Well, it's extremely important because, one, it's an historical document.
And no other Old Testament book has more historical information about Jericho than the book of Joshua.
The Bible's an ancient text, and the book of Joshua is an ancient text, and so we know the story in the book of Joshua is an ancient account. They were able to trace around the outside perimeter of the tell the lower retaining wall that holds in place the earthen embankment around the tell.
This short section of stone wall can still be seen at Tel Jericho today.
This is the stone retaining wall which held in place the earthen embankment that surrounded the city, and on top of the stone retaining wall was the mud brick wall.
On top of this stone foundational retaining wall, there was another wall, the city wall, which was made out of mud bricks. The three teams that dug Jericho were the German team from 1907 to 1909, John Garstang in the 1930s and Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Both the stone wall and the mud brick wall on top of it made up the outer wall that surrounded the city. Further up the embankment was another mud brick wall. This wall is what the Israelites were looking at as they marched around the city. This stone-facing wall, on top of it, a high mud brick wall. As they were marching around the city, they must have been thinking, how are we going to capture this city? Because it is so well fortified. Referring to our ancient text, Joshua 6:20 says that on the seventh day, at the sound of the trumpets, the wall collapsed.
And the Bible is very specific in how it describes that event. The Hebrew wording there is the walls takatha, fell beneath themselves. And on the seventh trip around, we're told in the Bible, the mud brick wall collapsed and it fell outward and down to the base of the stone retaining wall. And when the archaeologists dug in this area, they found this pile of mud bricks all the way along the retaining wall.
The Germans, Garstang, and Kenyon all found these piles of collapsed mud bricks while excavating at the base of the stone retaining wall.
If you have a brick wall sitting on top of a stone revetment and it falls over, where else can the bricks go? They've got to go to the bottom.
Does that tell us that there was a destruction of the wall?
Certainly.
These fallen bricks from the city wall can be seen in this diagram from Kenyon's excavation report. In her write-up, she makes it clear that it was not the stone retaining wall that fell, but rather the mud brick wall that once stood on top of it. The archaeological understanding of how the walls of Jericho fell matches well with the ancient description of the wall falling beneath itself.
This find of a collapsed city wall found here at Jericho is unique in archaeology. At no other site have we found evidence for a city wall that has fallen down.
That wall came tumbling down.
So the Bible says that the wall came tumbling down. The archaeologists then came and dug Jericho, and what did they find? They found a collapsed city wall.
Then you have the evidence from both sides, the literary evidence and the actual physical evidence from what the Bible is talking about.
Another interesting detail regarding the walls of Jericho is found in Joshua 6:20. It says that after the walls collapsed, the Israelites went up into the city. Kenyon's excavation report shows that the pile of fallen mud bricks could have been used as a ramp by the charging Israelites.
So what Kenyon's report says is that that mud brick wall collapsed off of this foundation, and it went all the way up to the top of the rim there, and it formed a ramp like this so that when the charging army would come, they could have run up into the city to attack it.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what the Bible says. Each man went before him straight up into the city, and they could do that by just climbing up over that pile of collapsed mud bricks, up over the top of the stone retaining wall, up the embankment, and into the city.
Joshua 6:24 then tells us that the Israelites burned the whole city and everything in it. To understand what a burned city would look like in a tell, let's return for a moment to our cake analogy. This chocolate layer represents a city that was destroyed by fire. Ooh! A burned layer stands out from the other layers of a cake, just as a burned city stands out when a tell is excavated.
When Kathleen Kenyon came in the 1950s, she opened up actually 5 squares in this area to kind of check Garstang's findings to see if she came up with the same results he found, because he found evidence for a massive destruction by fire. And he, of course, equated that to the biblical account, because the Bible says the Israelites charged up into the city and then they set it on fire. So she opened up these squares, and she found exactly the same sequence that Garstang had found. Vast destruction layer, about 3 feet thick of destruction debris, ash, collapsed roof timbers, and all kinds of things.
Now in this burn layer, both Garstang and Kenyon found room after room of large storage jars that were full of grain, and all of it was burned.
Yes, the burnt wheat found there at Jericho is very important because it ties in with our biblical story.
Joshua 3:15 tells us that when the Israelites crossed the Jordan, it was at flood stage because it was during harvest time. And we see in Joshua 5:10 that after crossing the Jordan River, the Israelites celebrated the Passover.
It tells us in the Bible, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, it was at flood stage because it was harvest time. Well, in the southern Jordan Valley, harvest time is in the spring of the year.
Containers, those pots were full of grain, therefore they must have been filled fairly soon after the harvest.
And so we know both agriculturally and archaeologically that Jericho was attacked after the wheat harvest had been taken in.
This is a very unusual find because grain was valuable. Why would you leave it to be burned up?
Joshua 6:18 tells us that while destroying Jericho, the Israelites were commanded to keep away from the devoted things.
Just the very fact that the grain was left to be destroyed in the fire tells us also that the Israelites obeyed God's command not to plunder the city.
The basic sequence of events found in the Bible describing Jericho matched the layer sequence the archaeologists found in the tell.
The evidence here shows that the walls collapsed first and then the fire happened. That's exactly what the Bible says.
In Joshua 6:26, Joshua said, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild this city Jericho."
On top of that destruction was this erosional layer. If you recall in the biblical story, Joshua pronounced a curse on Jericho. On anybody that would rebuild a city, there would be a curse on that person.
The ancient text tells us that the walls collapsed, that the city was burned and afterwards laid abandoned. When archaeologists dug at Jericho, they found that the wall had collapsed. The city had been burned, and it had lain abandoned for quite some time.